Let's turn our attention now to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is that big trade deal that was basically finalised in Bangkok. And joining us now, Professor of Strategic Studies at the ANU, Brendan Taylor. Thanks so much, Brendan. What are your thoughts on this in terms of the strategic impact of this, the strategic overarching impact of this trade deal? Because some people are saying that that's more important than the economic bottom line. What are your thoughts?
Yes, well, certainly it is a very important agreement economically. It's the world's largest free trade agreement, takes in about 30% of the world now. So that is significant. I think it is important though not to read too much into the strategic significance of this agreement. A former South Korean leader, President Park, used to talk about Asia's paradox, where she said Asia was a region where it was growing economically, but strategic tensions, security problems were continuing to deepen. And I think that remains very much the case. We're not going to see this agreement resolve the South China Sea disputes, resolve problems on the Korean Peninsula, resolve problems over Taiwan. Those will continue.
So how significant is it that India hasn't signed up to the agreement?
I mean, the door has still been left open for India. I mean, India is a very important economy now in its own right. It's going to become much more important in the future. According to some projections, it'll become the world's second economy by as early as the year 2050. So that's certainly very important. It's also important that the Americans aren't part of this agreement as well. And that comes back to that strategic point. You've got two very big, important strategic players in the region that aren't signed up to this. So I think it's a good development, but we also shouldn't overhype it in terms of its strategic significance.
One of the other components of this deal, the comparison that's been made, is between this deal, where China is the main player, versus the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US under Obama was the main player, but Donald Trump, of course, pulled out of that deal. Do you see China eyeing off a leadership role in terms of this trade arrangement? Do they see ground to be made up in terms of filling that void on free trade?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the important thing to note about RCEP is it is an agreement that's centred around or led by the ASEAN countries, so a small group of 10 small and middle-sized countries from Southeast Asia. Indonesia's played a very important role in that. So certainly China has tried to develop closer relations with these countries previously. Some have suggested that China is trying to carve out its own sphere of influence in Southeast Asia by using economic agreements to try to increase its strategic influence. So there certainly will be that dimension. But I think ASEAN has been, many of these countries have been living with China for centuries in some cases, and they'll be alert to that as well.
Yeah, but in that context, is it an upside then that if it's an ASEAN-led deal and there are rules of the road, so to speak, that China's buying into those rules? Is that a good thing? Because obviously we've had concerns about arbitrary decisions on imports that can be just flicked off, basically a flick of the switch and they're gone.
Yes. Yeah.
Having them sign up to these rules of the road, is that a good thing? Is that something that brings them, I guess, more into the agreed terms of international engagement?
Yeah, certainly from an economic perspective, I think having a kind of a rules-based order, to borrow a phrase that's often used, is important. But I think, once again, when we look back at that strategic dimension, without wanting to be too crass or cynical, often it's the power-based order that sits beneath that rules-based order that ends up being the most important in the strategic domain. And I think that's where, once again, we shouldn't overhype or have too high expectations for this agreement, because that power-based order will continue, in my view, to still be the most important determinant of strategic behaviour in this region.
Now, the other major development from the ASEAN summit was the fact that the Prime Minister did get a meeting with Premier Li Keqiang from China. It has come off the back of what's been some tense times in our relationship, especially not using them for the 5G rollout in Australia. Do you think that this really was a sign that relations are thawing?
I think certainly it was a very, very positive development. I mean, China is going to be one, if not the most important country in Asia in the coming decades, and I think Australia is going to have to learn to live with China in that respect. It's been a number of years now, I think 3 years since an Australian leader has met with a Chinese leader, or visited China and met with a Chinese leader. So Li Keqiang, the number 2 in China's system, that was an important meeting. Once again, I think it is a sign of a thawing in relations, but we've seen these thaws before. This has been an up and down relationship between Australia and China. It's likely to be an up and down relationship going forward. And I think that's going to require some self-reflection from Australia in terms of how we're approaching the China relationship, getting greater consistency in our relations with China and the statements that we make, deepening our knowledge of China. I think the Chinese know us pretty well. They've got a pretty sophisticated understanding of us. I think that's something we really need to work on here as well.
And in terms of the way that China's managed this, as Annalise said, face-to-face talks between the Premier and the Prime Minister, but the President's the one who is all-powerful in China. What are the prospects now of a visit by Prime Minister Morrison to Beijing? How keen would he be to get there? Obviously not waiting by the phone, but that'd be the next step, wouldn't it, in terms of that thaw in the relationship?
Yes. And I think certainly the prospects are good. I mean, a lot depends on what happens now in the coming weeks and months in the Australia-China relationship, but I think the prospects are good. I think Prime Minister Morrison has certainly said some sensible things on China, so I think he's heading in the right direction, but we'll need to see how the relationship unfolds and whether there's another bump in that relationship which could very easily steer things off course again.
Brendan Taylor, Professor of Strategic Studies at the ANU. Great to see you as always. Thanks.
Great, thanks for having me.
Great to get your insights. Let's